Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Oswa. It's great to see you here at the webinar. For the next hour, one or two people have dropped out and hopefully others will come in as we go along. For the next hour, we're going to talk about the corruption risk, particularly around our 16-step approach to corruption identification and prevention. And just to, I suppose, explain, first of all, my name is Steve Tosh and I'm the Director of Global Risk Alliance. And just to explain the reason why we've introduced this 16 steps, it's first probably better if I explain my background and why I've come to this point in our, I suppose, our development of risk mitigation around corruption. Over 20 years ago, I was in law enforcement and I worked in various elements of law enforcement. That included investigation around corruption and procurement fraud in high value and protracted contracts in the UK and internationally. I also ran a money laundering team later on in my career, and I was also the head of corruption investigations. But one of the key areas of learning, I actually was the head of an intelligence capability for a couple of years, and there was sort of 3 areas of learning in there, particularly around the use of data, particularly around crime risk and looking at risk within investigations and operations, but also how it can be used for tactical and managerial decision making around particular issues, particular events, whether locally or nationally, but also how we can use that data collected over a 12-month period, and how we can use that towards the, if like, strategic planning around risk, and what do we need to introduce into our organization, whether it's public sector or private sector, or different ministries, how we can introduce that locally or nationally, and the various organizations we need to engage to introduce risk mitigation around prevention, detection, looking at financial recovery, asset tracking, all those key elements. And that's where it sort of set me on the path to look at prevention. Because certainly in the investigation side and law enforcement side, prevention, particularly fraud and corruption, isn't really joined up as far as I can see. There isn't necessarily that consideration in investigations, and certainly for my part, it was actually seen as I suppose a nice to have, but we didn't really actually put much influence into it, resources and education, because education for me is key. And certainly around that structure, it set me on a path. And when I left law enforcement in 2012, one of the areas that fortunately I got involved with was the British standard BS 10501 on procurement fraud controls. So over a year, well, it was basically the first framework that I'd come across that I'd been introduced to that looked at the overall risk of an organization and what could be introduced. So for me, that was really important because it introduced prevention as one key element of it. But also risk and risk assessment as an introduction is an important part because it drives everything else. So that's why, and I'll touch on education later, why education is important, because ultimately, if you educate individuals, it increases data, because the report, you can look at your gaps in your organization structure, and it adds so many other elements. So I'll touch on that as the framework goes on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen and I'll just walk through the particular steps. So the 16 steps, I've basically broken it down into four key areas. Firstly, it's the risk planning. It's the risk assessment process. Then it becomes the implementation. And the final process is obviously I suppose the review and measurement of the performance of the anti-corruption framework and everything else that goes in with it. Before I go on, I'll say as well if you want to ask any questions, it's up to you whether you put it in the chat or whether we ask questions at the end. If you leave them to, it's up to you whether you ask during it. I'm quite happy for that, just to get clarification, or you can ask questions at the end. I'm more than happy for either. So I'll just carry on. So the first part is, firstly, it's looking at on the left is a diagram, is the cycle, that it's a continual review of the organization, from risk planning, the assessment, the design and implementation of the framework, the performance, that ultimately looks at goes back into the risk plan again. It should be a cyclical type of framework where we're continually reviewing its performance. And this is why if we do the hard work in introducing the first part of the 16 steps, then if we do it on an annual basis, it becomes easier over time because the hard work is done at the start. So the first step is the current frameworks. And if you haven't already received it, I certainly shared one of the first parts of the first steps in relation to looking at the procurement, fraud and corruption risks. So what have we got in place right now? As far as not just compliance processes, but also looking at the procurement, ultimately the policies, procedures, the systems and controls, and the people and expertise and capability that we have in place. So having that, looking at the procurement controls first of all, and certainly looking at, and I'm sure you're aware of it, is from, if you like, from the leadership perspective, what the policies say and what is actually happening on the ground. So it's always, we can ask the questions in a questionnaire, and we would certainly want to look at procurement, finance, quality assurance, and certainly asset management as well, because some of the biggest corruption cases I've seen is actually in the warehousing and asset management, because it's an area where organizations don't necessarily look or keep an eye on when they're looking at fraud and corruption risk. And some of the big, ultimately theft can be in the millions, if not tens of millions, depending on what controls they have in place. So it's having that structure, first of all, looking at the organizations, what they have in place. And the second step is then looking at the culture. And it's the same, to me, it's the same process. And what I mean by culture is the communication and engagement that we have with our staff, our suppliers, our partners, whoever's relevant in the organization, that we have that communication. Do we have, the normal communication from the tone from the top? Do we have an anti-corruption message? But ultimately, is there, leadership by example? Because it's okay to have a message, but how do we actually conduct our business, particularly as leadership, to set the example for everyone else? I always refer to one particular case that I dealt with a couple of years ago on a large project where we were introducing various forms of communication engagement. But one of the key elements was around the CEO of a large oil and gas organization from sending out a message, not only to the organization, but they wanted to engage with the public, local government and government itself to say, this is our anti-corruption approach. But the CEO never sent out that message. And after a year, they hadn't done it and they moved on. So what does that message say to an individual who, may work in procurement or administration or finance, who identifies a conflict of interest risk? Why would they report when leadership isn't interested in the approach? What protections would they receive if they did report? So having that culture and building the communication internally, and ultimately engagement of individuals, staff actually driving the anti-corruption approach. Because if you have their engagement and you listen to their voice and where we think we should go, ultimately gives them responsibility, ownership, and a feeling of actual fact we're taken seriously and we can drive this approach. Because I've seen it certainly in other organizations where health and safety is seen as the #1 risk. And certainly things like meetings, I've seen individuals ask, because it's ingrained in the DNA of individuals to always consider risk and health and safety risk, that individuals will be asked to talk for 1 minute before the start of a meeting around health and safety, any subject around health and safety risk, because it was ingrained in their DNA and they always had something to talk about and it was easy for them to communicate. And that to me is building the culture of an organization, and particularly communication. And also, how do we want suppliers to be involved in that as well? Because ultimately these are the individuals that will bring on board the bribery and the fraud risk. So again, how do we engage that? And it's just certainly something to consider. And then we move on to part 3, and I've called it the health and safety report, but it's just basically a culmination of, or a documentation of, all the areas of risk that have been identified at the starting point. What have we got in place, and what do we need to consider as far as risk? So we can use that document, if you like, as the foundation. When we then conduct a risk assessment, we can see what we've got and what we need to introduce. So it's keeping it that simple at the planning process. And also identifying the expertise around that, who's going to conduct it. That's quite important. But these are the 3 key elements. It can take some time because of the areas that we'd want to introduce, particularly looking at finance and asset management can take some time to put together. But once you've got it, year 2, when you conduct the planning process, it becomes a much simpler thing, and it allows you to conduct the risk assessment very, very quickly. And finally, I talk about basically anti-corruption frameworks, and I'll basically go on to slide 2 if I can. And it's basically, this is just an example. And the point of the framework, and if you like, the structure of an organization's anti-corruption control measures, policies and procedures, it's what is the flow of information within an organization, the decision making and the change management. Now at this stage, it's just, if like, for our organizations to consider again what they have in place and possibly put that in a framework to say this is the current design. And then we come to the end of it when we've done all our risk assessment, and what we need to then introduce, we can overlay the second framework. And just simply, I'll put this together for the presentation. It's basically, at the core is the designated compliance group, which I'm going to talk about later. But from that, around the decision making and the change management, is looking at, for instance, on the left in light blue, is looking at the risk itself and how we use that information for our organization, whether it's public sector and private sector. How do we profile the crime risk or the corruption risk, and how we use that information to then build the risk framework or the strategic approach, which I'm going to talk about later as well. Again, going top to red, how we report, what is the internal communication, where we identify risk, where we identify corruption, who needs to know, and how that information flows, whether it's to the board, the risk committee, or to the executive, and any decision making that comes out of that. So we have then a structured process to mitigate these risks. Again, left in green on the culture, which I've touched on. Again, it's looking at the engagement, the communication, the briefing, whether we want to add education in there, and also central library, which we've introduced into a number of organizations, where you have one key point where all communication, where all reports, where all policies and procedures can go in there, where individuals very quickly can be pointed to the anti-corruption work that's going on so they can keep up to date. And then at the bottom, again, from the compliance perspective, is looking at, again, the expertise, the capability, the anti-corruption policies and procedures, system controls. And off there, I've put a number of elements in there around, on the left, looking at areas such as a whistleblower policy, codes of conduct, conflicts of interest, etc. Do we have it in place? Because many organizations don't. An example, I was approached a short while ago around a company that wished to introduce a whistleblower hotline, which was fine because they worked in a number of countries. And then I asked the question, what compliance structure do you have in place? Because ultimately, once you have a hotline, because you're in 20 odd countries, you will naturally get reports. So there was no compliance structure in place. So it's it's a case of, do you want to introduce the compliance structure before you actually get these reports? Because ultimately, if you get a serious report, then you don't have the machinery then to respond to it. And that's where things can go wrong. So it's having these considerations when you understand what an anti-corruption framework should look like, then you can have a more accurate and more adequate response. And again, looking at, what are the policy and procedures around procurement, asset management. I could go on equality, finance, recruitment, because HR, human resources can be a significant weakness and target for corruption, allowing individuals into an organisation that are going to commit crime. So it's having that, or have a conflict of interest with a supplier. So it's having these strong controls in place to mitigate the risk at that point. So that's part one of the framework, and it's I'm trying to keep it simple. What I'll do as well is at the end of this, I'll send out the slides to you as well, just so you don't have to take copious notes, so you can use it as a sort of structure going forward. So then looking at the second part and looking at the, firstly is the topologies. When we're going to look at the risk assessment, is understanding the topologies of corruption and its links to procurement fraud and other financial crimes. In our training, I certainly talk about around 23 types of procurement fraud and corruption that can happen. And I break that down into, I suppose, 5 areas of the scope of corruption and procurement fraud. One is a completely insider threat, where an individual either steals an asset and creates false paperwork to hide the theft, or they've created a fictitious supplier, as an example, and then awards them work or services to ultimately divert the payments to their own bank accounts. So that's a completely insider threat. And then you can have your fraud and corruption, where an individual is linked to a supplier, whether it's through their shareholder or board member, or they're linked to a family member, and ultimately they're looking to divert contracts to that vendor for either a kickback or because they're linked to the company. And then you have your completely external threat, where you have maybe an individual company committing fraud by submission of false invoices, or you have a collusion of companies who are looking at bid rigging. So they're manipulating the award of the contract to one of the agreed suppliers, or they're inflating the price of the contract because they're going to incorporate a level of fraud in there as well. And finally, it's I suppose this, in the main, it's the cyber threat, and things like change of bank account details, where our organisation has been hacked, or an email has been hacked, or it's similar, and they're looking to change or manipulate the change of one of their vendors' bank account details. So any future invoices usually comes in it by an email or a letter. Any future invoices are to be paid to this account. And in probably 1 in 1,000 cases it'll work, but it can work. I've certainly investigated one myself where it's in the hundreds of thousands of dollars for diverted payments. So simply, that's the typology. So understanding that firstly, before you go into the risk assessment, gives you a greater opportunity to identify the risk areas, particularly where your staff are trained on identification of risk. And the second part is the data collection. And this, for me, I see in most organizations where they don't understand, particularly from the internal data side of the organization, what information they can actually use to look at corruption risk, particularly when you're looking at detection. It's not just around procurement and finance data. Is there quality assurance issues? Is there product failures? Why is there failures? Is there maintenance issues that may be linked to something? Do we monitor it? Or you've got your investigation data, your audit data, that in many cases I've seen isn't shared with the organization, that the people who actually investigate, like compliance, investigate corruption risk. They may only be looking at process failures. They don't necessarily look at the root cause, which could be criminal conduct. And also things like human resources. Again, do we compare staff data to supplier data? Things like names, addresses, bank account details, dates of birth, to see whether there are links to any suppliers, and also checking supplier data with new vendor data. So there's huge opportunities in the collection of data sources internally to actually build a profile of risk, and also having that information centrally held, because too many organizations, for instance, human resources, protect the data and won't allow any part of the organization to have that data. So we're losing a huge opportunity to actually see what the whole picture of the organization risk is. So having data collection and our own data sources is quite important. And also looking at the external reporting, things like the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners and their annual report to the nations highlights the typologies of various types of crime that, that organizations are being targeted by, because they question organizations annually around the various risks, around things like hotlines that, are they being used, and how the value of them, but also looking at things like counterfeit products and what the insider threat is as far as cyber. And it identifies the common methodologies that we can use to simply look at our own organization for a risk, and what are we doing about those particular risk areas. And then the risk assessment itself, and how do we build that data? And it's not just about the risk profile and around the various types of corruption and fraud that can be had, because there are many. I mean, when we look at, I talk about the 23 typologies of corruption and procurement fraud, but within that there are probably 20 areas, at least 20 areas of the procurement process and projects that can be targeted. And then when you look at the individuals who can influence the process, as far as within projects, project managers, who's the owners, the change managers, the quality assurance, as well as individuals on site and the suppliers themselves, there are many, many areas, in fact hundreds of areas really, where fraud and corruption can happen. So it's understanding that. So as far as building a risk assessment and then linking it now into the risk model, is how do we use that data and how do we engage others? And I'll just briefly run through the risk model here. Is first of all is the data collection, and I've mentioned that. Are we able to collect our own data, identify the data sources, and are we able to, can individuals report, first of all, because there are many organizations we're seeing that don't have a hotline. There's nothing on the website for it. I've had it myself where I wanted to report a fraud, but the only way to do it would be through customer services, which isn't the route. So that would put people off from reporting fraud or corruption. So it's having a designated point and a compliance capability to receive that information. So one of the key risks in any organization in losing data is having a proper structure and reporting process and things like whistleblower protection in place, that people feel more comfortable in providing information to an organization. And then understanding the risks that we want to look at, first of all, and I've highlighted a number here that can be used or not used around things like money laundering risk. One of the key elements, I'm currently in the process of finishing off a book on this subject, and an ebook, is things like money laundering, as far as there are various methods globally that are, it's not just vendors, who commit the fraud and corruption. There's, obviously the insider threat, and you also have things like, particularly the bribery cases on the FCPA, have highlighted the various routes that can be used in offshore accounts. So it's understanding the various routes where money can be diverted, that we can get a picture of how we then mitigate the risks. We have to profile these routes, first of all, in our own organization. As an example, one of the cases I dealt with a couple of years ago was in relation to, we looked at the financial data of an organization, and I simply looked at two key areas. I looked at change of bank account details, first of all, and there were a significant number of companies with they had changed. You would expect to see one or two change of bank account details in a 6-month period, and there was literally hundreds of change of bank account details. That was the first indicator. And then we if you like, manipulated the data, analyzed the data to look at particular risks. consolidated certain suppliers, and we looked at particular bank accounts. And in one example, I think there was 8 contractors going into one bank account, which wasn't linked to a company. It was quite clearly a personal bank account. So there was a weakness in the financial processes, and it wasn't necessarily that there was collusion in the finance department. I think from our investigation, they were actually just too busy. So when the change of bank account details came in, there wasn't any vetting by them in investigation to look at the credibility of the application, the internal application. So they just changed it. So it was a real weakness in the process. So it's understanding that that problem. I get the point of, in relation to corruption, is hard to detect, and this is one of the reasons. And a lot of it is around structure and corruption. Some corruption cases, and procurement fraud cases as well, because of the covert relationship of individuals that is done away from the business. Sometimes it can't be detected. I mean, certainly the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, I think it was around 6% of cases, and these were thousands of cases. It took more than 5 years to detect the cases. But a lot of that was around the fact that there was no proactive investigation or any investigation from particular organizations where a risk is identified. So it's introducing a formal process where we can continually look at the data and have a formal process where, if there is a risk or there is identified criminality, that we have a structured response, and not just a structured response as investigation, but looking at all the elements of the organization and who should have the ownership for prevention and investigation and audit, and things like change of policy. Do we need to look at procedure gaps? So it's having that structure in place, and I'm going to talk about that briefly in a minute. And then looking at, depending on what the risk assessment is for. Is it just for a company, a small company, or a large company, a large organization, or is it for a national public sector organization? How does that affect, or an international organization that is in 20, 30 countries? How do we ensure that we cover all these elements? And it's having that, building the structure around who do we need to engage to look at the national and international risk, who do we need to engage to look at the people and organisation threats, so the insider threat and external threat, and the various scopes of our procurement, fraud and corruption and financial crime. Is there a transnational crime threat in there? Things like counterfeit products. What is the risk to the organisation, depending on what the organisation does? And again, understanding the various routes and methodologies of the fraud and corruption. And this might be impacted by, as it says, the products and services or the transactions. For instance, the banking sector or the finance sector might be different from oil and gas or the public sector, but the methodologies are the same. The only thing that will be different is necessarily how they do it, and the product or the service or the components that are involved. The methodology doesn't necessarily change. It's just the tactics that are involved. And then we'll look at the response plan, which I'm going to talk on. It's looking at the how does the organisation respond, and what structure do we have in place. And it's looking at these 6 key elements. It's looking at the prevention, which I'm going to talk about, financial recovery. Ultimately, if we have a loss, how are we going to target that? Are we going to do it through the contract? Are we going to do it through civil recovery, or are we going to do it through criminal proceedings? So it's having that structure in place in that discussion where we know what the plan is. So if something happens, we know exactly who to call. And if we haven't got that support in the organisation, for instance, if we haven't got a compliance capability, do we want to have something on standby where we know if there is something, we know the company or organisation we're going to contact to introduce an investigation or a financial recovery. And again, things like disruption as well. This can be where the breadth of the corruption isn't understood and how many people are involved. So it's how do we disrupt it? If we have a financial loss and we don't know the breadth of the financial loss and who's involved, do we want to disrupt it? And what I mean by that is, do you want to move people from contracts, move people from positions? Do we want to add different controls in place? Do we want to have things like annual sign-off of ethics policies, just to disrupt individuals? And certainly one example we introduced when we were aware of individuals, what we weren't aware at that time was the level of corruption that was involved. We introduced an annual sign-off of ethics policies and conflict of interest policies. And the individuals who we knew were involved refused to sign. So for us, it was a big indicator that we got the right people involved. They did eventually sign, but they'd already indicated that they were a significant red flag in our investigations. And then looking at detection techniques, which I'm going to talk about, and then ultimately looking at the risk and how we use that risk information, and how we link that back into things like education and investigations. And ultimately our response in a structure, and looking at, again, as I said, the systems controls, the data sharing, what organizations do we want to engage? Is it to be done internally, or do we have partners? Certainly in relation to things like law enforcement, one of the benefits of law enforcement, certainly I saw that back as far as 2010, was, for instance, international partners, law enforcement partners, where we were working in the same area. For instance, British contractors working in US contracts and vice versa. We shared methodology of the types of fraud and corruption that was happening in particular contracts, so they could have a look at their own contracts to see whether the same company was conducting the same type of crime. And then certainly one occasion that I was involved in, that was the case. And it was simply, they were overbilling for project managers, where the large program of works dictated that there was a requirement for 10 project managers. They were only providing 3 and billing for 10. And those individuals were being used on other projects as well. So in many respects, they were double billing. So it's having that, who do we share the information with, and how do we maximize the opportunity to detect corruption and procurement fraud? And again, then looking at our expertise and our capability, and the risk and the strategic approach, which I'm going to touch on in a minute. So that's the second part. I know I've sort of rushed through it really, but it's just to give you a flavour of the structure and how basically one area links to the next, and then if you take out one element, it won't work correctly. You have to have all these elements in place to allow the structure to work, to maximize the opportunity to collect information that will ultimately drive your response. And move forward. Right. So the next area is the implementation. And I talked briefly earlier about the health check document, and this is basically the same. The next step would be to document all the risks in a risk register or a risk matrix document that allows you to identify, what the risk is, where it's happening, and ultimately what your recommendations are. So it allows you, again, we talk about the internal communication, it allows the risk committee to make decisions, or the CEO or the executive to make decisions about these risks, and what the consideration now should be for the organization's anti-corruption framework. So what should be in place? Because one of the, and it goes back to the point of corruption is difficult to detect, but many if not, I wouldn't say all, but many of the problems with corruption is if you like, the insider threat. The individual knows where the weaknesses in the controls are. And it's that simple as that. So if we understand that ourselves, and we recognize that, people do trust their staff, but we should still implement controls and control measures and expertise to ensure that they're adequate and make the changes as required. So this is a point. We may never ever identify the individuals that are involved in corruption, but we can continually review our process to look at the risk as far as what the data tells us as far as the crime risk, and also what our controls are in place. Because there's no point in putting a strong controls, for instance, in finance or procurement, where the issue is in quality assurance. So having the data at the start will drive the risk assessment. And for me, that's the most important part. And that's why I always go back to education, is education will drive everything else. It drives the assessment, it drives individuals' motivation to identify it. Because one of the big things with training is there's been numerous occasions where I've provided the training where individuals have realized that fraud is going on in their organization at the time. And also they've made a number of companies have made significant changes in their compliance programs, as far as things like introducing whistleblower hotlines, introducing a compliance capability, or introducing a data management capability because they had a significant bribery risk around various elements, including the use of cash for events, as an example, and paying individuals. Now, when the company comes under the FCPA, that suddenly becomes a much bigger risk. And they realized that, and because of that, they introduced a number of procedures, and one of those was a data management capability to look at their own data as far as payments, because it was actually the human resources department that actually was involved in event management. So, although it's still procurement, but it's just a lot of that was in relation to cash. So it's just something to be aware of, the diversity of the information and where you can have it. And again, until we stepped in there, the organization was completely oblivious to this significant risk to the organization, because whether there was bribery or not, there could have been the perception of bribery. And particularly when it comes to FCPA, they could have been hit really hard and had a particular criminal investigation, where in actual fact there was no crime being committed. And then we look at again, I've just given a brief diagram here just to look at, again, it's about design because the working parts may, the 16-step process may look significant, but if we put it into like a diagram of what our organization structure should look like and the framework should look like and who we should engage, it suddenly becomes much simpler. So for me, it's really important to highlight these key elements. And plus, depending on the size of the organization, the scale and the continents that are covered, they may not need all the elements of a framework compared to a small and a large organization. And that's, again, it's something to consider. There's no point having a racing car of a compliance system when we only need a mini metro as an example. And then we have our next step is the reactive response or the prevention response. So what do we have in place, or what do we put in place as far as risk mitigation? Things like when we're looking at the onboarding process for vendors, what do we introduce there to prevent fraud and corruption from happening, to ensure that we don't onboard the wrong vendor? So do we actively look at the organization's capability? Do we visit the vendor? And also, do we look at the anti-fraud response that the vendors got themselves? So do they have an education program? Do they have ethics policies and procedures? Is there a tone from the top? Do they have something on their website that promotes anti-corruption? So it's these little things that would give you more comfort that an organization actually considers anti-corruption or anti-bribery as part of their process. So for me, the prevention part can be quite significant, and what we introduce when we've documented the risk register, and then looking at, if you like, the compliance frameworks and what we should consider. And then moving on to the proactive response, and what I mean by that is the data analysis is one key element. We've also got things like your audits and how we use those reports, how we look at the weaknesses in our organization, but how we present that and use that. But data analytics, there's so many areas within the organization. It's not just procurement and finance. It could be around quality or an asset management. Do we have significant losses? Do we track our assets? Do we have an asset register? So how can we use that data consistently to look at the risk? As an example, one organization, we looked at the data and they had $5 million of losses annually. And we simply looked at the high value items that were lost. Well, they called it lost, but they didn't know whether they were stolen. And it's quite clear that a percentage was stolen. Looked at high value, the most regular quantity of losses, and the most attractive. So things like computers and computer screens, which were the attractive items, and then looked at prioritized those for review. And it was quite clear that there were certain items that were stolen because they're stolen in volume, and they were lost in transit. So we were able to narrow down that the items that were removed were actually for a construction company, and the individual involved in transportation, or either in the transportation or the receipt, was the areas where the items were lost. So you're able to narrow down your insider threat and where those things can be removed. But again, it's ensuring that the procedures in place and the data is recorded in the first place, because if you don't have that, you will never or are less likely to identify the corruption. As one example, one organisation, I've mentioned it many times before, an organisation that we reviewed for a bribery risk, their procurement team, who went out and talked to suppliers, were allowed to use WhatsApp. So there was no visibility in the organisation's communication between individuals and the supplier. So when we looked at the bribery of a particular individual, we could not detect it because there was no communications to look at, to audit, and to see that relationship. So that was the first thing that had to change in the organisation, because they had a proper insider threat. It was quite clear that there was many individuals involved in corruption and bribery and requesting bribes, but they didn't know how to tackle it because of their own systems. So it's having that documentation in place in the first place. Things like single source justification forms. Organisations will use single source, particularly in urgent requirements, but we still have to document the process. And if there's no documentation, then there's no ability to audit or review the risk areas. So it's having those the data management systems in place that will allow you to collect the data in the first place. Because when you have data loss, certainly one organisation we looked at, it was quite clear that data was deleted because that's where the fraud was. So it allowed us to, and hard copy files were destroyed as well, but it allowed us to look in depth at those particular risk areas, because it highlighted where the risk were. We were able to identify who the individuals were involved. And then we look at, finally in this section, is the designated compliance group. And you can call it what you want, but it's a group or a collective of individuals in the management or leadership team who can make decisions around particular risks and ultimately the change management process. So where we have an identification of a corruption risk, as an example, it's going to the fraud response plan there and saying, right, who's going to cover prevention? Does it link to HR in this situation? Does it link to audit? Not so much audit, but procurement, finance, are the policies there? What do we need to change to ensure this doesn't happen again? So it's allowing the organisation's decision making. Because particularly going back to law enforcement, one of the challenges that I had was, we could conduct investigation and identify the individuals, but law enforcement won't release information on the investigation, which restricts the organisation's ability to mitigate that risk and future risks. Because if there's crime still ongoing, how do we ensure that it doesn't continue? So it's ensuring that we have the connection between, as I've highlighted some there, the procurement department, the finance department, if there's a risk, quality assurance, audit, and compliance, but there can be others in there, particularly human resources. It depends who's in charge of policies and procedures, and particularly when it comes to ethics policies, who's the owner of those policies, what needs to get changed? Do we need to change practices as far as things like, if we have annual performance reviews, do we want to have actions in there around anti-corruption for individuals? Do we want to ensure that they sign off conflict of interest policies at that point as well, to ensure that it's introduced into the organisation as the culture? So it's how we use that process at that point, and how we use, the decision making and change management in an organisation, and that's what the designated compliance group is. And then with that, the final parts of the 16 steps is to ensure it's introduced. Does the organisation have a fraud response plan, or an anti-corruption response plan, or a compliance plan? And it's documenting the ownership of each individual or part of an organization. So when we do get hit by a corruption risk or a fraud risk, or this methodology can relate just to any other risk, not just a crime risk, is how we introduce the ownership of this. And it's not necessarily a tick box plan, but how does the flow of information work? How does it change in decision making? And to ensure that it doesn't interfere with investigations, ensure that data is shared. As an example, we looked at a bribery case a number of years ago, and it was an IT project with international ramifications. And what became clear after our investigation was concluded, about 6 months to a year later, we found out there was an audit actually conducted of the whole organization that identified, and it was to do with the procurement of consultants on this project had been going for a number of years. And there'd been an audit done of single source procurement in that organization, and it highlighted the many failings of the organization. Now, the only way I found out was because it was leaked into the press. And what it highlighted, and if I'd have been told at the time, what wasn't looked at was the root cause of the problem. Because if we were given that at the time, that would have created a much bigger investigation. Because it was clearly, because of the insider threat, people knew where the weaknesses were. They had a single source justification process, and they even had a board to look at single source procurement, but it wasn't working correctly. Single source wasn't documented correctly, and the approvals process wasn't getting used correctly. So people knew that who worked there, but quite clearly it created a high risk of corruption and procurement fraud. But they missed the opportunity to investigate it. So again, this is where the compliance group and the response plan becomes important, because that creates the structure of the organization's decision making and change management. And it allows, particularly where it can be documented and communicated to leadership or the organization or to partners, it's how we do that within the organization to ensure that when something happens, we have a consistent approach to this type of risk. And then moving on to the strategy, again, this moves on, if like, as part of the risk profiling and risk assessment. Again, it's looking at the 1, 3, and 5 year plan of an organization and what we need to introduce as far as the prevention, detection, investigation, financial recovery. What is the framework? It can't all be introduced immediately, because it might be increased resources, building the structure of our organization, introducing hotlines. So it's what plan do we need to put in place to ensure that this strategy is introduced? And that should be done and reviewed, certainly for me, on a 6-monthly basis, and certainly updated on an annual basis to look at whether anything, particularly with the new risks identified, whether that needs to be introduced into the current strategy. And second to last, penultimate, is the measuring and monitoring. Again, vitally important, and something that's many occasions is missed, is the system working? What we've introduced, does it work? Is risk still carrying on? Looking at the data, things like, particularly where I've seen it in organizations where they've been hit by multi-million dollar corruption cases, but up until that point, there were really small fraud. There was no real cases coming into the organization. And then they get hit by this massive corruption case. So they don't understand where they're going wrong. So then it's looking at where we've introduced the new framework, is looking at the investigation reports. Are the values the same? Have we got an increased number of reports? Have we got increased number coming through the hotline? It's looking at our own data to see the performance in the mechanisms. Is there compliance? Do we record non-compliance of policies and procedures? And do we want to, what action do we want to take as far as a group into introducing other controls? So it's having that measurement in place, because that will ultimately lead back into the planning process, for the next cycle, if like, depending on how the organisation treats it. If we do it on an annual basis, that information, because it will be set, to me, it will be assessed over a 12-month period to look at the increase. Because if we've introduced a new hotline, if we've introduced new capabilities, if we're building the culture, the natural consequence should be an increase in data, increase in reporting, because individuals feel comfortable reporting, particularly if we engage the public, the suppliers, and we allow the route for reporting, there'll be a natural consequence. And then finally, looking on to the training awareness, as I've mentioned at the start, to me, although the typologies were touched on in point 5, training awareness as the final element is important to link back into building the knowledge and capability of the organization. Because it allows you to, for the individuals to look at their own business area, first of all. It allows individuals involved in compliance to look at the structure. It allows, for instance, one example, in our sort of training courses, one day we put aside purely to look at a live project. And once individuals, for instance, in procurement, in finance, and project management, in the executives who make the decision making, individuals who are engaged in the project, if they are actually engaged in the education around the typologies and looking at the risks, when you overlay the risks on the project, they are the experts within the project who can tell you where the risk areas are, where there is that interaction with the vendors and the contractor, where there are the risk of product substitution or individuals that can be targeted by a bribe. So it's thing is, on the education side, that then allows them to, for that live project, it allows them to build a risk register for that project. And particularly where it's regular, a particular project is done on maybe on an annual basis, on a contractual basis, that risk register can be used again and again and updated with the next project and next project. Because certainly from my perspective, you will have a project plan in a project or program of works, and you might even have a procurement plan, but I've very rarely, if ever, seen an anti-corruption or a counter-fraud, a procurement fraud plan, where they'll look at fraud risks throughout the lifetime of the project and individuals that can manipulate the process. So really, that's more or less it for the discussion. The one area just to highlight to you as well is these are some of the solutions that we talk about and we've introduced, because for us education is key, because I'm quite happy to go into organizations, but the value and the success is changing the understanding of the organization to manage their own risk, because it's not easy, but it can be comfortably done, and that's where we will maximize. There's no point paying consultants to go in and and change things and identify the corruption. It needs an overall consideration of the risk, and for me, education is key, and that's why we've, for instance, introduced e-learning, introduced online training, our instructor-led training, but also our mentorship programs as well, for one-to-one mentorship with organizations, so they can maximize the opportunity around this sort of 6-week program, so we can direct them through the change process. And we've also, just to make you aware if you haven't already seen it already, is we have just introduced the Anti-Corruption Education Network, which is basically a global network of experts. It's just new, so we're building the capability that has not just the training courses in place, but also has the guides to the 16-step approach. It has particular groups as links to individuals and global experts to allow that discussion for organizations and individuals, for their professional development and the building of the capability. So I would certainly suggest to you that you look at joining that. Certainly It's £150 a year, but we're for the first 6 months it's going to be £10. So it's something to certainly consider, and I'm happy to share the link with you. And also we have the knowledge archive there as well within the system within the ARIN network, because it allows us to add things, additional training courses. We've got a number of webinars and podcasts in there that discuss particular areas of risk. So that's my talk over. If you've got any questions, I'll stop sharing the screen, and I'm happy to discuss any questions with you.